Cuando adoptamos el modelo de la libertad, allá por el año 1860, en 35 años nos convertimos en la primer potencia mundial.
With these words, Javier Milei gives his version of a common narrative of Argentina's history. It began the 20th century as a rich country. If not the richest in the world, as Milei claims, it was at least up there with the richest. It then became a relatively poor country. Milei also explains why.
Mientras que cuando abrazamos el colectivismo, a lo largo de los últimos 100 años, vimos como nuestros ciudadanos comenzaron a empobrecerse sistemáticamente.
Milei prefers the term collectivism, but economists also use terms like populism, statism, or perhaps just Peronism to explain why Argentina became poorer. That's the standard narrative of Argentina's decline. Statism, Peronism, collectivism turned it into the poor country that Milei has to govern today. In his version of the story, Milei seems to be drawing on the Madison Project, a database of the GDP per capita of numerous countries, supposedly normalised by purchasing power parity to make them internationally comparable. This is Argentina's GDP per capita relative to the US GDP per capita in the 2018 version. I think this is what Milei is looking at. It shows that Argentina's GDP per capita was higher than the United States in the 1890s, which explains why Milei is convinced that it was once the richest country in the world. It then experienced persistent decline throughout the 20th century. The problem is that the Madison Project is very unreliable. In the latest update from 2020, for example, Argentina has been downgraded. Its GDP per capita in the 1890s is no longer higher than the United States. Why is not exactly clear. But such revisions of the data have been typical since Angus Madison first started compiling these statistics in the 1980s. And that's why I don't trust them. Instead, I've been working on my own estimates of Argentina's GDP per capita relative to the United States. I'll briefly explain what I have done. I begin with the various estimates of Argentina's GDP published over the past 100 years, converted to US dollars at the official exchange rate, shown in per capita terms relative to the United States. I then splice the various series together. Next, I adjust them for the price levels in the two countries. The result is Argentina's GDP per capita relative to US GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. And it tells quite a different story to the Madison Project. I'll talk you through it. The Golden Age lasted from the 1890s through the 1930s. Argentina's GDP per capita was about 50 to 70% of US GDP per capita. It fell during the First World War, but there was a significant recovery afterward. The impact of the Second World War, by contrast, was far more persistent. You can see the war years here. Since then, Argentina's GDP per capita has consistently been around 30% of US GDP per capita. This is not the standard narrative of Argentina's history, and I was surprised when I saw it. But it is what the data tell me. It has made me focus on three big questions. The first is how Argentina became wealthy. Where did the Golden Age come from? The second is what happened during the Second World War. And the third is why the impact of the Second World War was so persistent. I'll tell you my hypotheses. The first is that there was a long-term boom in the terms of trade after independence, which allowed Argentina to bring its vast land resources into production for the world market. The Golden Age was the result. The Second World War was then a major shock because of the breakdown of the world market. It led to the country's impoverishment, seen in the structural break in the graph. Argentina then suffered from a problem of expectations. It had been a rich country before the war, and Argentines still expected to be rich afterwards. They wanted the same kind of welfare state that was being constructed in Western Europe and its offshoots. But the country struggled to pay for it. The result was distributional conflicts, inflation, and political instability, the things Argentina became famous for in the post-war period. Here is the grain of truth in Milei's complaints about collectivism. But, and this is a big but, I am not as pessimistic as some, including Milei. GDP isn't everything. If you look at other development indicators, Argentina is catching up with the United States. Life expectancy, for example, is almost at the same level. The average years of schooling of Argentine adults is rapidly catching up with those in the United States as well. There has been progress. So maybe that collectivism was good for something after all. Moreover, even in terms of GDP, Argentina has not been falling behind for decades. there was a one-off structural break, but no prolonged decline. And if you look closely, you could even argue that it has been catching up with the United States since the 1980s. In my heart, I like to think that this was a result of the return of democracy. The generals weren't very good at running things. For me then, the data suggests that there are grounds for being optimistic about Argentina. Maybe someone should tell Milei?